Thanks for giving us the opportunity to collaborate with the Havens Rights Center. I had a lot to say to introduce Dr. Mohan Dutta, but I'm going to say less because I want you to hear from him directly, but I do want to highlight a few things. Dr. Mohan Dutta currently serves as the Dean's Chair Professor at Massey University, and he's the founder of the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, which beautifully abbreviates as CARE. He's a decolonial theorist, a public scholar, and a frontline activist whose work is a sustained radical commitment to dismantling the oppressive structures of colonialism, capitalism, and racism. And this is both in theory and practice. This is reflected in the bedrock upon which his activism is built, the culture-centered approach, or CCA, which we will hear more about today. And this work has taken place globally, both it's in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in West Bengal, India, and in Singapore. In all of these places, he has worked with communities in solidarity to resist state violence or to build community. His accomplishments are too long to list in a short introduction, but I will highlight a couple. In 2020, he was elected as a fellow of the International Communication ICA Association. In 2021, he was recognized as a distinguished scholar by the National Communication Association for his social justice-driven scholarship. And in 2021, the ICA recognized him once again with the jewel in her crown, which is the Aubrey Fisher Mentorship Award for his support of junior scholars. He has served as the editor for the Journal of Applied Communication Research previously, and he is currently the chair of the Ethnicity and Race in Communication Division at the ICA. In these roles, he ensures that the field's most prestigious journals and professional bodies center marginalized voices and decolonial scholarship. I could keep going on, but I know you'd rather hear from him and me, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Mohan Dutta. It's an honor to have you spend some time with us today.
This conversation on organizing for social justice will particularly feature the work that we do here at CARE, the center that I direct. And I want to first acknowledge the many communities that we partner with in building what we call these radical infrastructures for voice democracy. And this takes the form of community-led interventions. And what I describe as interventions cover a broad range, all the way from land occupations to organizing struggles in labor movements, to growing food, building healthcare systems. So there are both material aspects of these interventions in terms of building material solutions, as well as public policy and advocacy aspects in terms of organizing to seek structural transformation. We have had the privilege of working across multiple countries and doing this work, and therefore really having opportunities to test the key tenets of the culture-centered approach that I will walk through. And what is central to this work is the role that community researchers, activists, and organizers play in terms of building the knowledge base. I want to here acknowledge the work of my colleague, Professor Graham Hingangaroa Smith, and his partner, Professor Linda Tuhuai Smith, who talk about the Ringaropa method, which is the method for building theory through the work of doing the actual building. You know, Graham says in his work that the measure of Kaupapa Maori theory, which is a decolonizing theory that emerges out of the struggles in Aotearoa, is evident in the calluses on your hands. And that's really powerful in terms of the invitation it offers for us to rethink the very idea of theory, as Linda talks about theory as extractive practice, and inviting us to think beyond the practices of extraction to notions of connection, community, and embeddedness in struggle. So this is a theme that will play throughout this presentation. I will begin by talking about a concept that is at the heart of the work of the culture-centered approach, which is the concept of communicative inequality. And I will theorize communicative justice in relationship to this notion of communicative inequality. Then I will put forth the concept of voice infrastructures, which forms a core tenet of the CCA, or the culture-centered approach. And then I will wrap up with discussing some strategies for sustaining resistance, particularly outlining the kinds of challenges and threats our center has experienced, our activist partners have experienced, and sort of articulating some of the strategies potentially in terms of how we negotiate these threats. So when we think broadly about the notion of marginalization, it has a material component in terms of the ways in which it structurally disenfranchises communities, households, individuals who are placed at the margins. Now, the culture-centered approach connects this notion of marginalization to communicative inequality, or inequality in the ownership and distribution of communicative resources. I will go over what these resources are in a bit, but the key argument here is that communicative inequality and erasure are core features of marginalizing processes. So the unequal distribution in society and unequal ownership in society of a range of communicative resources actually shapes the lived experiences and struggles with marginalization. This is from, Anirban was talking about our work at CARE, and this is some of the earliest work at CARE, building what we call interventions in radical democracy and democratic participation among Adivasi people in eastern part of India, in Jharkhand and West Bengal. And that looks at the ways in which you reimagine democracy through community ownership of resources. So in this work, and the earliest pieces of paper that were published out of this were about 2 decades back in 2004. I argue that inequalities in the distribution of information resources, resources for generating knowledge claims, for creating evidence, for owning that evidence, and then resources for representation, decision-making, participation, and voice shape the contours of marginalization. Particularly salient here are the ways in which we theorize information resources. Often in the dominant approaches to information, information is thought of as an individualized commodity that communities can benefit from through the one-way distribution of information. This forms the zeitgeist of the diffusion of innovations framework that has often been used in Global South contexts to conceptualize information and information dissemination. Now, what this work with the CCA does is it invites us to reimagine that notion of information, to think through information as a structural resource, information as a resource around where to locate structural elements of education, health, income, and how to go about then navigating these structural resources by accessing information. Beyond that, though, it is also a politics of evidence making and evidence-based ownership, which becomes critical in how we think about communicative inequality. So in Aotearoa, for instance, organizing of Maori have consistently pointed to the portrayal of Maori in deficit-based statistics. So if you think about health outcomes, education outcomes, outcomes within the context of crime prevention, these are all framed within hegemonic logics of the settler colonial state, extracting information from communities and then framing that information and in ways that continue to perpetuate settler colonial violence. So within that context, the CCA grapples with that question: what does it mean to create evidence and own evidence anchored in communities such that communities are able to enact sovereignty over that evidence? In Kapapa Maori that is talked about as Tinoranga Tiratanga, a fundamental tenet that forms the basis of Te Tiriti of Waitangi, the um, contract that was signed by Rangatira Maori chiefs and the crown, which assert that sovereignty over knowledge is a critical component in the enactment of community sovereignty. And the other point I want to also note here is in terms of looking at resources for voice and decision making. So the CCA consistently points out that marginalizing processes work through the erasure of community voice and opportunities for community participation in decision-making processes. Now, our empirical work has documented the cyclical relationship between communicative and material inequality, the ways in which communicative inequality from voice and representation to media access, platform ownership, narrative control or narrative sovereignty, and digital divide are shaped by material inequalities, but also the ways in which then these communicative inequalities in turn shape the material inequality. So there is a back and forth relationship between voice and material resources. Material resources enable communicative power, which in turn secures material advantage, creating a perpetual cycle of inequality. So within this theoretical framework, then we can conceptualize communicative justice as ownership of communicative resources in the hands of communities at the margins, as well as organizing to create equitable distribution of communicative resources in societies such that those who have been historically and systematically disenfranchised can participate in decision-making spaces. This image that you see here is an image from a campaign that was co-created in Singapore by community advisory groups of transgender sex workers who are organized in a sex workers collective called Project X. And the collaboration of CARE with Project X was built around an intervention called the Stiletto Project, which organized to secure safe housing for transgender sex workers within the context of Singapore's authoritarian structure. So I use this as an example of communicative justice because this work foregrounds the struggles to build voice infrastructures that are owned by transgender sex workers within the broader context of authoritarian techniques of power and control. And at the same time, trying to build democratic processes within a context where there is a performance of democracy while simultaneously deploying a range of state processes to silence voices of communities that are placed at the margins. So in the CCA, and this draws upon foundational bodies of work on post-colonial and decolonizing theories, and particularly from subaltern studies theory in terms of the ways in which it conceptualizes the notion of erasure, but building erasure into the communicative processes, then the CCA argues that the erasure of histories, bodies, knowledges, and lives are tied to the four interpenetrating dimensions of settler colonialism, imperialism, racial capitalism, and patriarchy. These systems are mutually constitutive, cannot be understood in isolation, and they shape then the active processes of erasing. Now, the CCA engages in conversation with the Subaltern Studies Project then with a critical question, and this is sort of a point of departure or engagement with Gayatri Spivak's notion of can the subaltern speak, with the question, what does it mean, for instance, in the context of Indian historiography, for upper castes to talk about the possibilities of listening to subaltern voices or the impossibilities of listening to subaltern voices, while simultaneously Adivasis, oppressed caste peoples have always already been speaking. So within that context, what does it mean to recognize those speech forms, those voices, and then in an active living context, what does it mean to partner with, to find friendships with, drawing inspiration from John Beverly, to explore processes of co-creation, recognizing that co-creation is not a process that is without power. The in creation is replete with power, including the power embedded within the academic structures that are the sites of collaboration. So erasure, when we think about it within the context of settler colonies, and I will specifically focus on the settler colonial context, we have extended this work within the context of caste and South Asia when thinking through post-colonial contexts. But in settler colonial context, the interplay of whiteness and white supremacy work through the ongoing marking of the primitive other. Now, the primitive other is marked through two interpenetrating tropes, one of the threat of violence, which shapes the ongoing marking and surveillance of the terrorist other, and the ongoing construction of the discursive nodes of civility, tone policing of resistance, for instance, proper discursive practices of truth speaking, with the communicative rules embedded in the structures of whiteness. In fact, this is where I have done quite a bit of my writing around, is the ways in which tropes of whiteness shape the conversations on civility. But as we see within the context of the Israeli genocide that has been carried out in Gaza and the ongoing settler colonial project, we also see the ongoing manufacturing of the trope of the terror or the terrorist other as a process to criminalize, to securitize, to continue to then justify state violence and state terror. So this process of marking that the other as the source of terror, on one hand, obfuscates the role of the state as the resource of terror, as the site of carrying out terror in the settler colonial structure, but also legitimizes the ongoing work of carrying out terror in order to erase. And we, of course, see this as a global phenomenon. We certainly see this in the US in terms of the current geopolitics and the marking of the terrorist subject, which is critical to rendering silent accounts of rape, genocide, land theft, slavery, theft of resources, mass displacement, and theft of knowledge. So this architecture of material violence of whiteness is built upon disinformation as a communicative resource. And this is also my critique of contemporary social science approaches embedded within whiteness in terms of how they approach disinformation. They approach disinformation as if disinformation is a new thing, as if it is a feature of platforms, then focusing on individual levels solutions such as media literacy, bias detection training in order to build responses to disinformation. Such an approach that individualizes the very production of disinformation fails to take into account the strategic use of misinformation and the historic sense in which colonial and racial capitalist apparati have deployed disinformation to steal land, to enslave peoples, to legitimize rape and genocide, of course, communicatively inverting it as a project of civilization or civilizing mission. So the strategic use of misinformation to deceive and manipulate is a feature of the colonial project that builds, perpetuates, and upholds the colonial racial capitalist structure. And such a critique of disinformation then invites us to rethink what does it mean to challenge disinformation, and what does it mean to fundamentally change the very structures through which disinformation is produced. This is an example that I will draw from our work with the 1969 project. This is our work with the survivors of the genocide in Indonesia that was carried out in the late 1960s through the active involvement and engagement of the empire in Cold War politics. And critical to that production of genocide was the use of its information to mark the others, to create mechanisms of surveilling the others, and then to collaborate with infrastructures of the post-colonial state in order to carry out the violence, all the while framing it as democracy promotion. So the empire's others expelled from land, from food-sustaining practices, from practices of collectivization and resource redistribution, become the sites of targeting. Institutionalized architectures of hate, incarceration, police military violence. So violence in multiple layers form the infrastructures through which then the colonial project and the imperial project of democracy promotion have worked hand in hand. So it is democracy for the white population while systematically erasing the democratic right to lay claim to rights, resources, cultural resources for people that are colonized and that are marked for targeting. In this broader picture of colonial rule, what we also see is the ongoing incorporation of local elites into the colonial structure. We certainly see this within the context of India with the incorporation of the caste elites into the colonizing structure, but also recognizing that the racial mechanics of the caste system itself played a key role in shaping the scientific racism of the British Empire in terms of its production of knowledge for colonial management purposes. So there is a two-way flow here in terms of the participation of local elites and the upholding of the colonial project. So the colonial structure draws upon pre-colonial inequalities in order to continue to prop up the structures of inequalities. The pedagogy of local elites into the colonial system becomes critical to colonial divide and rule strategies through the participation of local elites and their collaboration with the colonial capitalist nexus. So within the context of the Indian subcontinent, we can consider the question of caste, and within the contemporary context, the question of global Hindutva. Within the context of Southeast Asia, we can engage with the question of the Asian turn in spaces like Singapore, notions of Asian modernity that are deployed to prop up new forms of capitalist exploitation and extraction. We can think of Operation Dudula or the Rohingya genocide. So what I'm arguing here, and this resonates with the work of Olufemi Taiwo, is the participation of local elites in the perpetuation of these structures of exploitation. So if we think of democracy, or the democracy project within the colonial architecture as critical to the maintenance of communicative inequality, the culture-centered approach then asks, well, what can we do to challenge these inequalities? What are the processes of organizing that are necessary in order to transform these inequalities? So the CCA argues that at the heart of the process of transforming these inequalities is the work of listening to voices and building spaces for voice sovereignty. So the ways in which it conceptualizes radical democracies is through the notion of voice sovereignty, the ownership of voice infrastructures in the hands of communities at the margins who can enact their agency, both drawing upon cultural forms, but simultaneously using these cultural forms and stories to critique dominant cultural forms, hegemonic cultural patterns that reinforce, uphold, and reproduce structures of violence. So as a starting point for the next part of this presentation, I want us to listen to a couple of voices of community organizers who have shaped some of the fundamental pieces of work that we do. And you can see the ways in which the theory of voice is articulated as an invitation to academics as part of the structure to listen. So this notion of partnership, or this notion of friendship turned into an invitation where communities own the spaces where they can articulate their voices. So Auntie Rosie, who's a lead community organizer in our work on health disparities in Indiana, this was in 2010, says that the powerful want to tell things the way they see them in their own way, in ways that feed their interests. So what is your role? And she's saying this to academics, engaging in this conversation with a community organization that is mobilizing around questions of racial inequality. Listen to us, work with us, collaborate on things that we can do on the ground that represent our interests. It has been so many times that our interests are not really heard. And this is something we consistently see in our work where communities talk about the research process itself being extractive. Linda Tuhuai-Smith talks about this as research itself is extraction. So the community feels isolated and no place to go to. So we work together. It's an invitation to solidarity in making the avenues where our voices can be heard such that, and I think this part is really critical, such that they matter. In our work with oppressed caste women farmers who run sanghams or women's cooperatives for alternative farming in the backdrop of the neoliberal onslaught on agriculture across rural India, the Deccan Development Society, and Nadamma, who is a lead community organizer of the Deccan Development Society, talks about storytelling with cameras and the power of cameras in inverting the power, but the notion here being that the ownership of the cameras and the form of storytelling is held in the hands of communities. So the notion of communicative sovereignty. They run a radio station. So she's talking about this. When we run the radio station in the community, we tell the stories grounded in our lives. So it's not the money that the big people pay to sell their version, which is always about making profit by making fools of us. And she's really talking here about the large-scale advertising of BT seeds that has inundated the communicative spaces and ecosystems in these villages, and challenging that through the ownership of this community radio, through which they can talk about seed sovereignty or the notion of Bij Satyagraha, the drawing from the Gandhian principle of rejecting the market-based notions of seed control. So on the radio, there are stories of what farmers are really going through here in Warangal and in Pastapur. Warangal and Pastapur are two spaces that have seen some of the largest incidences of farmer suicides amidst the farmer suicide epidemic that has been brought about by this large-scale transformation into neoliberal agriculture. So in the backdrop of this image, for instance, you can see that the women, what they do as they run the community radio, they also participate in knowledge making, such as, they plot out through these community meetings the various fields that they collectively own. They plan out what they are going to grow in these fields and what kind of crop rotation cycle they are going to work with so that nitrogen is retained in the soil. And that's just one example. So CCA as a method of organizing radical democracies then explores how we collaboratively invert the dominant structures of meaning making, and in turn build patient listening to an ethic of the other that seeks to embody solidarity as the basis for working toward other imaginations. So this idea of solidarity then in the CCA is rooted in voice infrastructures as the spaces through which communities organize radical democracies. This is what Amar says in rural Jhargram, says that when we make these decisions about our health, our forests, our cultures, and our languages, we live in our best health. So this work turns into the enactment of communicative sovereignty through the building of processes for safeguarding the forests, for safeguarding the trees, and at the same time, safeguarding indigenous relationships with the trees. And in that sense, challenging the implementation of the Forest Regulation Act and the forestry departments that continually encroach into indigenous relationships with the forest and the ecosystem. So the notion of communicative sovereignty then is based upon this idea that communities own the communicative resources that are essential to their power to tell stories. So when we look at the context of Gaza, for instance, we see the power of communicative sovereignty, where the capacities of the colonized to control and own communicative resources and narrate stories of colonial terror disrupt, if you will, the architectures of media narratives within the hegemonic structures of whiteness and white supremacy. So this is an example of Bisan Alda, the journalist from Palestine who gave us everyday accounts of the violence in Palestine. I'm going to listen to her voice. So these kinds of voice infrastructures within the context of the most recent genocide um, uh, actually disrupted the hegemonic media control over narratives and the ongoing erasure of Palestinian voices and Palestinian accounts, which in turn created global infrastructures for mobilizing communities. Here, this is Auntie Moana. She talks about the ways in which voice infrastructures through photo-based storytelling bring about resources for communities to draw upon indigenous knowledge to create practices of protecting the environment, safeguarding the environment, and safeguarding indigenous practices. So in this particular video, Aunt Moana is talking about the ways in which drawing upon Maori knowledge shapes community practices for safeguarding the environment. But she also says, she offers a critique here of the dominant approaches, or what she calls the Pakeha, or the white man's approaches to safeguarding the environment, which fundamentally erases indigenous participation and indigenous voice while projecting to uphold practices of safeguarding the environment. So for her, narrative sovereignty is key, particularly in resisting the co-option of indigenous knowledge to serve the structures of whiteness. Here's another example of the work with the Deccan Development Society, where the women talk about agricultural sovereignty as connected to voice sovereignty. So what you actually see here is various practices of sovereignty connect with this notion of control over voice and being able to have a voice in determining what kinds of knowledge practices to engage in. So this is Kamtaman. She says, I know what I want, what food I want for my family. I'm not going to let my husband or the seed agent or the government worker to tell me what to grow, making false promises to me about lots and lots of money. Money will come and go, but these food crops, these are our own and they will pass on. We have to pass them on. So she talks about an intergenerational knowledge that turns to indigenous knowledge as a way for reimagining how to practice agriculture. So I'm not going to play this video. This is from our the collaboration with the Ngāti Kofata Iwi here in Aotearoa. And it actually shows a land occupation. And in the land occupation, through the work of building these voice infrastructures, communities tell stories of the land, the relationship with the land, but also the story of colonial theft. Now, what that essentially does in this particular context is it counters the city councils, the local governments, and the state's narrative of privatization and incorporation of this land into privatized logic for the adaptation for climate change. So particularly within the context of climate colonialism, indigenous sovereignty is really critical in continuing to retain Tinuranga Tiratanga, the notion of Maori sovereignty within the context of Aotearoa as articulated in Te Tiriti. These relationships are also rooted in the ecosystem and relationships. So the concept of whakapanangatanga, for instance, in Aotearoa, connects land with familial relationships, whanau referring to relationships. So when whanau collectivize and lead food organizing by connecting to ancestral land, wairua referring to the spirits and bodies are nourished, hearts are filled, and our minds are sparked with future possibilities and reimagining. So remember, we talked about the land occupation. This is the very space where the land occupation took place. That also is a space where the community grows marakai, collective food gardens, which Maori have systematically and historically done to grow and share food openly. And again, this articulation decolonizes and challenges the ways in which whiteness approaches, for instance, food gardens as if it is an innovation from the structures of whiteness to respond to climate change, while it's systematically erasing brown indigenous global south bodies. So ecosystemic relationships that are fundamental to knowledge generating practices of the global south. These voice infrastructures are also rooted in the body and in the uh, uh, presence of the body amidst struggles and expression of voice. I am a trained dancer and choreographer, and the kinds of projects that CARE works with in terms of community theater, street protest, articulate these architectures of voice through which uh, articulated sites are created for challenging both capital but also state control. On the when you're facing the screen on your left-hand side, you see some images from the transformative work of Jananatya Manch. This is a theater group that comes out of left politics in India. Many of you would have heard of Safdar Hashmi, one of the key architects of this street theater movement, who was killed while performing a street protest. But this also gives you a sense that body as a site of voice infrastructure has been a part of diverse global South traditions of radicalism and radical resistance. So these voice infrastructures become the basis for articulating decolonizing knowledge. I want to wrap up, so I'm going to move through these last set of slides fairly quickly. But they're also materially grounded. So this is an example of an indigenous language school that we have worked with a community in Jharsuguda in West Bengal, in building, where we now have school teachers that teach Alchiki, the Santali language. And they do so while also teaching the core literacy and numeracy subjects. And this infrastructure is built through the participation of the community, centering indigenous language and culture, and at the same time building registers of literacy. These processes are rooted in collectivization. So here I had for you an example of our work with Bangladeshi migrant workers in Singapore. And this work of building voice infrastructure shaped the migrant workers' rights campaign that we co-created in Singapore. And that was critical in organizing, particularly for food justice, where the kinds of food that are accessible to migrant workers through contractors are often contaminated, often of poor quality. And these became this voice infrastructure became the basis through which workers could organize to transform this fundamental delivery structure for how food is distributed in the community. Beyond that, though, this infrastructure really became critical during COVID in creating registers for talking about poor housing conditions, crowded housing conditions where the pandemic quickly spread, and in disrupting the carefully constructed straight narrative. So it's a beautiful example of voice democracy in action in terms of resisting the kinds of authoritarian repression that are imposed by structures. So these voice infrastructures, I will wrap up with 5 key points. These voice infrastructures form the basis for articulating redistributive commitments. So fundamentally, looking at the ways in which we think of knowledge as a privatized commodity and challenging that, to think of knowledge in redistributive commitments that articulate material politics that resist the colonial capitalist interplay. So in this example, this beautiful song, actually, I wish I could play it for you and you could hear the song. The women are singing to the seeds, waking the seeds up. And then what they do once they wake the seeds up is they go from village to village singing these songs in processions, distributing the seeds. And I had an image of that procession. So you see, this is a procession where they're carrying these seeds from community to community, distributing them. Voice infrastructures also become the basis for organizing democratic ownership. So here in Aotearoa, as part of a global pattern of attack on indigenous rights, we see the ongoing attack on Te Tiriti as a foundational document. And what we see through these voice infrastructures is the participation of Maori in articulating alternative notions of democracy through notions of love, redistribution of resources, intergenerational care, care for the earth, community, and relational ties, which actually builds the basis for pedagogies of democracy that fundamentally differ from how whiteness conceptualizes democracy as private property and ownership of private property. So narrative sovereignty at the margins as a basis for challenging disinformation and hate then creates spaces that center joy, love, and hope, center solidarities as connections between communities. So on the left side of the screen, you have this sort of white supremacist structure in the form of Hobson's Pledge here in Aotearoa, which would be similar to your Turning Point USA kind of structure that goes from community to community, mobilizing against Maori and indigenous rights. So in that backdrop, the protests that happen at each of these events is filled with song, as you can see, communities singing the waiata, performing the haka, centering love as the basis for building alternative registers. In India, you see similarly the ways in which, in the context of the rise of Hindutva and the politics of Hindutva, Muslim women reconfigure the notion of what democracy means, reconfigure the notion of what the constitution means. So the participation of the very margins in democratic processes forms a key element in the CCA in a sort of regaining our power over democracy and challenging fascist control. And then centering Aroha, centering love in relational spaces as the basis for how we think of participation and democracy. Once again, I had a video here in our work with transgender women here in Aotearoa. It's a project called Aroha Kite Tangata, and it centers the notion of transgender love as the basis for reimagining what democracy looks like. So these various ideas of love, hope, and imagination then bring us to the space where we can think of possibilities together. So in this context, Kaitia Kitanga, this poster in the background is talking about the intergenerational role of guardianship of the earth to protect Papatuanuku, which refers to the earth. So my last two screens are about what happens when these voice infrastructures work. So when the voice infrastructures work, they create registers for transformation, but there is also tremendous backlash from the hegemonic structures. And within that context in our work, we have found two things that are really critical. One is rejecting the economy of permission, particularly being in the academe, when we are sort of built into the kind of bureaucratic mechanics within neoliberal structures that uphold the politics of clientelism, that uphold particular metrics in order to measure how we do our work, that sort of construct relationships in the form of sterile community engagement projects where sort of the resources are supposed to trickle down from academe into communities. So rejecting the economy of permission is an invitation for us to rethink those fundamental relationships within which we sit in the academe. As Tame Iti, the indigenous activist in Aotearoa, who served as an activist in residence at CARE, invites us to say that the work of decolonization is not out there, it is in here, in the academe and in these spaces, in terms of how we rupture that. But it is not just about the curriculum either. It is fundamentally about finding those spaces of solidarity that can undo the logics of clientelism and profiteering that are built into that academe. And then how do we build and sustain subterranean spaces of sustenance that are invisible to the hegemonic structures, that are hidden from techniques of repression, that can go undetected by hegemonic structures, and that can then patiently wait for openings. With that, I will wrap up to say that, in our work, what we have found is quite amazing, which is the power of communities who have systematically been disenfranchised to reimagine, to color our ideas of what democracy is. And that's where I see hope. Namihinui.
Hi, Mohan. From the smile that's on your face, I believe you recognize me as an old partner in crime on several of these discussions. I'm very glad and happy that and fortunate that I got to hear you today. At UW-Madison, I'm researching. I'm doing research in traditional storytelling methods of India, of North India and Pakistan, and especially how both those stories and the practices of telling stories got effectively butchered as a very strategic colonial enterprise. And this idea of communicative infrastructures is really interesting to me, because I want to ask you as to how the CCA today kind of envisions a communicative infrastructure. So, for example, a lot of the examples that we had today are examples where something is being digitized or produced for it to become an infrastructure, for it to acquire infrastructural status. But I know for sure that culture-centered approach, and very rightly so, banks on the idea of culture as a resource, like cultural practices and cultural epistemologies as the very resource that is the bedrock of a lot of that activism. So I kind of want to connect, and then we also discussed towards the end the idea that we are looking at one of the desirous things is to find ways where we can sort of dodge the radar and go under and sort of do care-centric work. So I want to kind of hear your thoughts on how these storytelling practices and the stories itself that are pretty much, I mean, extinct today, at least in the mainstream. What role could you conceptualize for this as contributing towards communicating infrastructures or becoming communicative infrastructures? Yeah, so that's the end of my convoluted question. Sorry.
Good to see you, Rahul, and it's a great question. And I think you're right. The kinds of examples that I shared with you of communicative infrastructures, a number of them are digitized or articulated through infrastructures of platforms, if you will, that at least need some kind of platform hardware. Broadly, though, there are other pieces of work with the culture-centered approach that completely bypass these digital and hegemonic media spaces, if you will, and turn to art, creative storytelling. And part of that is intergenerationally listening to that which has been lost, collectively mapping and tracing beautifully, as you point out, those practices that have been erased through the violence of colonialism and the architectures of caste, if you will, right? So even, and this is a critical point, which is that communities are not monolithic spaces. Even within community spaces, you have multiple layers of erasure that at work. In Indian context, you often have caste at work in terms of the ways in which Dalit voices are erased. And one of the things that I find powerful there in Dalit storytelling, for instance, is turning to intergenerational practices like talking to grandparents, drawing upon memory and memory work to talk about ancestral practices of telling stories, writing poetry, performing arts. That actually then create the generative basis for how we think of infrastructure. So how do we get from that work of memorializing and remembering and drawing upon memories to actually building communicative infrastructures now is a critical question. So a lot of the work that we have done within those kinds of contexts is to actually map out what those infrastructures look like. So for instance, with migrant workers, the work we have done is around poetry. Bangladeshi migrant workers in Singapore, they write poetry and they pull together those poems as communicative infrastructures and then collect those poems as the basis for intervening into the structure of the state. So something like poetry becomes quite radical, to the, and it's beautiful that you talk about subterranean spaces because one of our poet collaborators, Jahangir Bhai, when his work became prominent and visible, the state immediately rounded him up and deported him. So there is always a challenge in terms of what happens when the communicative infrastructure becomes visible such that it is recognized. And then how do you sustain that structure? Because when it does become recognized, there are multiple threats to it. To some extent, one might argue that when an infrastructure is really meaningful in making a difference, that it will face threats. That's when you know that the work is actually happening because it is facing the pushback from the structure.
Um, I'll let others think in the meantime. And I had two questions for the sake of brevity. I'll ask only one. And I think it's a kind of a follow-up to Rahul's question about infrastructures and technology. And I was thinking back to two of the examples that you showed us and thinking about this in terms of images. One was women with video cameras in hand, right? Which inverts the structure of looking and also producing. And the other is the image of the journalist speaking to others, but on a platform like TikTok. And so my question goes towards platforms, because that's where I begin to get a little suspicious, because platforms are also corporations. And I'm wondering how would you conceptualize a sustainable voice infrastructure when it sort of collides with the logic of platforms, which are also surveillance spaces and spaces for profit?
What an awesome question. So, and we have really struggled with this question, Anirban, in our own work. And one of the things that consistently communities at the margins, say, for instance, in a land struggle, have talked about is in the absence of voice infrastructures where communities can enact sovereignty within the mainstream media space, platforms, albeit replete with their structures of surveillance, extractivism, and corporatization, also become the entry points for creating these alternative stories and alternative narratives. So the land back movement, for instance, they were able to push the council away from taking the land. Now, in sort of the articulations of that community advisory group, a key element in being able to do that was being able to narrate the story through their own holding of cameras, then putting up that story on multiple digital platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So I think that is a really powerful conversation in terms of the extractive logic. So here in Aotearoa, for instance, there is a movement for data sovereignty that is talking about how do we enact data sovereignty when engaging with platforms. But I think that and how do we center ideas of data justice when we engage with platforms? And it's really interesting because I've looked at things like platform cooperatives as infrastructures, including we have here in Aotearoa a space called Action Station that is a platform infrastructure that bypasses these dominant platforms. But I think if I were to summarize one of the lessons learned, Anirban, it is this, that at this juncture, it's not possible to entirely bypass these platforms. So you see with the Palestinian struggles, the Palestinian activists I've spoken with, they say that Twitter or X was a critical resource in changing the narrative around Israel and in changing the narrative around Gaza. Particularly in terms of the ability of particular handles to get the story out. In fact, I was just talking to an activist the other day who has been violent, a transgender activist who's been targeted on X, and they were saying that, I haven't really left X, but even though I know that that's a space that is replete with white supremacy and the ongoing surveillance that is deployed through that platform. But the reason I haven't left X is because I also know that that is the space where I need to intervene to get the message out. So it's an interesting tension, I think, Anirban. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. From a strategic standpoint, it seems that the notion of boycotting platforms or rejecting platforms or developing alternative platforms has to work alongside thinking through how we co-opt the architectures of platforms to get stories out at the same time.
Thank you.
Anirban, you're welcome to come back on that if you'd like.
I can, and this is something I think about a lot. And more as I think about platforms, because I teach about platforms and I write about platforms, I become less and less optimistic, because it feels like, we've moved away from the Arab Spring moment to what is now X, right? So the Twitter revolution has been sort of co-opted into the dominant logics of the state as well. But I also see what you're saying in terms of this is still a space. This is a space which is not only white supremacists, other people are also on those platforms, so that a conversation can go on. I think the thing that I struggle with most is what happens when the platforms, which are oligarchies, start cooperating, as they always have, actually, with state control. And I don't have a definitive answer to that. It's something I'm working through myself.
Can I, this is a beautiful, beautiful point. So, I have an ongoing piece of ethnographic work with anti-fascist activists here in Aotearoa. And this is a really significant and powerful question, particularly with the current marking of anti-fascism as terror, right? And that has implications because New Zealand is part of Five Eyes. So this is this notion of state repression and violence is quite immediate within that context. And, one of the things I was hearing is that, folks saying that surveillance is already happening. It isn't as if we can escape that. So at least that was the more immediate logic, that, this awareness that I'm already being surveilled, right? So I am going to put my communicative articulations in this space, knowing that there is surveillance, but also that we are going to distribute that collectively, so that it's not one person, it is not one activist that can be targeted, but there is a much wider movement, So as states repress, and particularly you think of examples like Palantir, Palantir signed an agreement with New Zealand SIS precisely for that kind of data harvesting purposes. But I also think that at least in the activist community, there is a deep awareness of not walking away from the structure because there is that surveillance, but rather to find ways of overwhelming the structure, or find ways of countering that structure within those spaces, because it is those structures that are particularly being deployed for the politics of fascism, if you will, to recruit more, right? Whether it is Hindutva or whether it is white supremacy, it is X, it is Meta, that actually serves the infrastructure for recruitment. So many activists that I speak with reject this idea, for instance, that we can go to blue sky, or we can find a liberal space of escaping that is our safe space. In fact, I'm working on a piece now that critiques this notion of safety, because it's safety for whom? And for people who have historically been colonized, have been erased, it has always been unsafe,
Thank you for that. Wonderful. So I have two questions from the audience. I think, again, it's interesting to find that our audience is definitely picking up on something, some sort of theme, which is you've touched on before, but I think it's worth coming back to. Pete writes, many culturally centered interventions are time-bound and depend on funding or external support. How do you think culturally centering organizing can be institutionalized without losing the radical content and the radical edge of the organizing in and of itself? And then the second question is, when different parts of the community contest what cultural meaning or values should guide organizing, what should organizers do in your view? Who gets to define cultural legitimacy in these contexts?
Wow, amazing questions. I love those two questions. The first one actually is beautiful because, for CARE. So what you're seeing with Project 25 in the US, I think there are parts of it that are already here in New Zealand. And it's quite amazing because we're a small country. I think we are quite adaptive to particular global trends and we can implement them fairly quickly. So one of the things that we have seen is our Marsden grants, for instance, which is our grants for sort of carrying out large intervention-based projects, which would be example equivalent of your NIH, NSF grants. They have already ruled out humanities and social sciences funding totally, completely, right? And then from other funding mechanisms too, basically they have marked out these woke terms will not be funded and define the category. So things that you're seeing in the US. Now, in some ways, I feel for CARE's work, this moment has been quite transformative in terms of foregrounding this articulation that our work is not dependent. It draws on funding to sustain people, but it is not dependent on funding to do the radical work of organizing in communities, because the radical work of organizing in communities is led by communities, really, where we are friends in listening, friends in building partnership, and then we explore what are the ways in which we can build. So there are a lot of things like timeshare, volunteer time, other ways of organizing time and resources that become critical. And that also, like I was talking about, rejecting the economy of permission, I think that is really critical because, our usual tendency as academics is to say that, oh, if I'm not going to have the funding, I'm not going to be able to do the work. And that is economics of permission. In fact, sometimes I have wondered, and so, work of CARE has gone from a piece of work where we have not written up any funding application to a piece of work that is $2 million in funding, right? So there is a whole range. And over the years, I'm increasingly wary of the idea that we need funding to do the radical work of transformation. And I say this being deeply aware that I'm a full professor with lots of privileges that protect my position and that enable me to say that. But one of the things that I've found is that often with the diktats of the funding structure itself, there are particular rules that prevent the work from being radical or the most transformative. So I think it's important to listen to communities and turn to communities as a resources for guiding the conversation. I will keep my next response short. Communities are spaces of deep inequalities, absolutely. So this is why a concept in the CCA is margins of the margins. So how do we listen to the voices of the margins at diverse intersections? So this idea that what is culture itself is contestation, that what is culture itself is a dialectic, that the very notion of defining culture as a monolith is an oppressive project, is a project that seeks to create erasures by defining culture as a monolith. So it's been beautiful because, the work that we do on Islamophobia, for instance, it's been ongoing conversation in partnering with mosques, for instance, in terms of how do we co-create spaces for transgender Muslim women, and those kinds of conversations can be difficult. But those kinds of conversations can also be critical. And I here bring up the example of mosques, but I think it's also important to think about the idea of culture as if it is something elsewhere that doesn't interrogate our investments in cultural projects of whiteness and white supremacy in that sense, right? So culture is not just there in a community that is struggling or in a community at the margins. Culture is also here. So when we think about this idea of culture as contested spaces, it's also an invitation to interrogate the kinds of cultural habits that we sit within and that reproduce architectures of erasure and silencing.
Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for your work too. I want to know what you do in terms of ethics of working with this community as collaborators. How do you do that in your work, and how do you negotiate copyright issues if you see them as collaborators instead of like participants or human subjects? Thank you.
A beautiful question once again. So first of all, in most of this work, the idea of research design, what is ethics, comes through the process of dialogue within communities. So we have what we call community advisory groups, and these community advisory groups have internal ethics review bodies set up within them. So for instance, for Maori here in Aotearoa, Maori are organized in iwis, which are tribal structures, and within those tribal structures, there are ethics bodies that one has to work through first before going through institutional ethics. And in fact, what you find often is that there are often tensions between institutional notions of ethics as opposed to community notions of ethics, and there is an ongoing negotiation of that. When it comes to copyright, you remember we talked about communicative sovereignty, and what that essentially means is that the copyright of the work is first and foremost owned by the communities and community advisory groups that participate in creating these interventions. At that point, though, the community advisory groups can make decisions in terms of they want to do copyright or they would like to develop these interventions as copy-free, that is open in the opens to be distributed and shared. And again, that's a community level decision, Ephraim. So this whole process of research ethics, copyright, who owns the content turns into the hands of communities. But that also means that in terms of authorship, in terms of when to publish, in terms of whether to publish, actually, we have done pieces of work where we haven't published anything at all from the work, because that was the sense of the community advisory group. There are other instances where we have waited for 7 years or 8 years before starting to write something up. So, and then in most instances, we have community partners, community researchers, community organizers as authors of the pieces that participate in that collaborative process of writing. So those are all examples of decentering, if you will, the research process, the whole of the research process. The most beautiful part of this work for me is when the organizing of communities actually decenter the very idea of what it means to generate academic work or do academic theorizing. I find that to be quite powerful, because that also challenges sort of our norms or normative ideas. So, like I would say, I'll give you an example. I have heard multiple Palestinian activists say this, that when it comes to decolonization, you have reams after reams of decolonization scholars that have written plenty on it, but have completely gone silent when it comes to the ongoing genocide in Gaza and have nothing to say. And I find that invitation quite powerful, because I think there are two kinds of academic habits. One is, and this is whiteness, but this is also upper caste takeover, which is the tendency to take over struggles and then position oneself as a hero or heroine of the story, or perform a whole lot of white guilt or upper caste guilt around that kind of autoethnographic navel gazing. While what communities often say is what is needed is not your reams of academic writing after a genocide has been unleashed and carried out, pontificating on the gender dimensions of famine, but your actual intervention into the violence as it goes on, drawing upon your power. So that actually, I think, is an invitation for us to rethink what does it mean to engage as an academic, and particularly our tendencies to center ourselves as the heroes of the story, the radical comrade of the story, if you will, right? And I think why the CCA is powerful and why it bristles upon sort of established hegemonic academic structures is because it critiques this notion that academics sit at the center of driving the stories. Because when community voices own the narratives, that means that narrative sovereignty has to be decentered, right? And this is something I say with my work on Hindutva. In India, for instance, you would see plenty of pontification on Hindutva and the organizing of the authoritarian fascist state. But when it comes to taking on or challenging the state, most academics writing about it will go hiding. They have nothing to say when it comes to publicly intervening into the structure, as bodies of Muslims are continually placed on the line. So I think there is a critique there. The other thing I was going to say is what we learn from communities about solidarity. One of the most powerful things I've witnessed when targeted from various forms of repression, when the center has been targeted, is the support that has come from community. Much, much more so than from academics or from the academic community. And I think I will give you an example. When for instance, we have faced a series of white supremacist attacks. It is Maori, there is a Maori collective called the Manaki Collective, So this Manaki Collective offers security, including cameras, including people to be there with you, psychological, emotional support in Maori psychology through Maori healing practices. When people are targeted. And I found that to be absolutely amazing in terms of where that support has come from. And to me, that is quite telling in terms of where change comes from. I'm increasingly skeptical that social change comes from the academe. I think that social change almost always comes from within communities and within struggles. And the invitation for us is how do we embed ourselves in these struggles and learn to listen. And that is not showing up with a placard on a march and then taking photos for Instagram or Facebook. It's building those relationships and sustaining them.
What a deeply powerful response. Thank you for that, Mohan. Robert Howard, you have the last question. So I believe you have been enabled to speak. So please, if you are able, turn on your camera and ask your question.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I don't have the button for turning on my camera that I see, but I guess, sorry about that. But yeah, fantastic talk. I really appreciate the positivity that you're bringing to these often, I think, difficult topics. And the question I have is, I'll try to make it quick, but it kind of comes off what Anirban was talking about relative to platforms. And I was thinking, well, it's interesting, and I'm sorry to put it in the U.S. context, but that's what I'm struggling with at the moment. We're thinking that in the U.S. context, like the Maori example you just gave about communities helping out in this organized way is really fantastic. But there's also the issue of, like, in the U.S. context right now, what we really find is that you have a bunch of really competing communities, in fact. And, I think I was thinking about in terms of platform use, because it seems in the United States right now, right-wing activists are using platform technologies extremely effectively. And that's, created a situation where we have a real polarization. So it seems like a lot of the distinction you make between, like, a government or an institution not seeing things in the same way the community does, and the community needing to have a voice there. What are your thoughts about the current situation? Or maybe you've experienced situations when you mentioned the mosques and transgender people. That was maybe something like that. But do you have any advice for us when we're thinking about how we can deal with a complicated situation we're looking at in our sort of daily lives here, which is that there's really a significantly effective and empowered set of communities who are using all kinds of technologies, are mobilized in rural areas, are a lot of the things that we think of as a community, but they're communities that seem to be fostering, and in fact, in my view, and many of our views, I suspect, enabling some very intolerant and unhealthy moves, including, at the very least, just to throw out a less ugly one, is, they're fully in support of removing grants for the humanities, for example, for the sciences, for that matter. How do we work in a situation where you have these competing communities? And have you experienced things like that in your work? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question, and what a big question. I want to preface this by saying that I've been out of the US from 2012, so it's like 13 years. So I think my understanding of the US social context is limited in that sense. But I would suggest a couple of things. The first, I think, we had so anti-transgender hate is one example, and I've been sort of working with transgender activists here in terms of how we counter that. A lot of that is mobilized on X, at least in the New Zealand context, that is mobilized on X, that interfaces with the kind of figures you're talking about. So we see the interfacing with Proud Boys, with Tommy Robinson in the US. So this is a globally networked movement, just like global Hindutva is. So in that sense, what you see in US maybe is not so different from what we see here in Aotearoa. But what was really powerful in terms of, so we had last year sort of a real peak in anti-transgender rhetoric with the visit of a British anti-trans figure called Posey Parker. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Posey Parker, this whole TERF movement. And as we were studying platforms, particularly X, Instagram, and Meta, Facebook, what we saw is the peaking of anti-transgender hate in the New Zealand ecosystem, both in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and both in Facebook and in Twitter. And the ways in which transgender rainbow coalitions here in Aotearoa chose to resist that is not only by building offline brick and mortar forms of resistance, but also taking those stories onto those platforms that were disseminating the hate. And this is what I mean by going into those spaces, Robert, if you will, which is that not letting the narrative go unchecked within those spaces. So there was a lot of narrative around transgender rights, around notions of Aroha, like the campaign that I was wanting to show you, those stories placed upon the very platforms where you were seeing this, what you would call the polarization. So this idea here is that the countering of polarization is by bringing the speech or by bringing the voice infrastructures into those very structures that are driving the hate, if you will, so that the hate on those platforms doesn't go unchallenged, And I think that's really a critical question. I will give you one example of this. With the murder, with the violence we saw with the whole Charlie Kirk incident and the backlash of that, here in New Zealand Parliament, we had right-wing politicians wanting to commemorate Charlie Kirk. So I had just put out a video, again, a TikTok video, and I did that because, we have activist advisors who said that it's important that narrative of our politicians is countered. And I put it as a TikTok video that then was shared on X. And that just brought in a swarm of a campaign, including a politician saying that I should be fired from my job, and then letters written to the university and things like that. But one of the things that was quite critical in that juncture was to counter that narrative on those very platforms itself with diverse stories or with other forms of stories, if you will. But what I want to wrap up by talking about is that if you're going to engage in those voice infrastructures, in those platforms where you see the disinformation and hate, it's also really critical to think through what other spaces, like I go back to Rahul's question, that you have where communities can center ideas of Aroha, love, connection, community. So the ways in which you sustain those spaces of countering is by also having alternative spaces, alternative architectures, alternative platforms where other ideas can be celebrated and put forth. So in that sense, I really think we need pluralism, we need multimodality, but I also feel that as platforms proliferate, it is important to counter the messaging on these platforms. So that's what I would say. I want to wrap up with an example that I've been watching quite closely is the Zoran Mamdani campaign. And one can have quite substantive critiques of Zoran's positions, particularly when it comes to Palestine. Is he selling out? I think this is a question I've seen activists raise. But I think at the same time, what is really powerful is that that campaign is going to the same spaces that we have been talking about on TikTok, on X, on Instagram, and creating a story, and creating a story around working class politics, around disenfranchisement of the working class, around questions of food, clothing, housing, healthcare, those fundamental kinds of questions. So I really think that these are opportunities and openings for shifting the narrative that can only happen when we enact our narrative sovereignty and foreground the kinds of communicative articulations that foreground solidarity, that anchor solidarity. I want to wrap up with this point. I am skeptical of the notion of safety and the ways in which that is weaponized to run away from necessary conversations, if you will. I think that we need to think of safety in ways that center ideas of solidarity and the idea of how do we connect across struggles and connect across people. Like when you talk about the rural question or the recruitment grounds for rural communities, at the same time, I think it is really important, at least in our work, we do that by talking to working class communities, by talking to communities that face various forms of economic disenfranchisement and seeking to build architectures of connection through that. Thank you.